Welcome back, friends, to EDR from Afar. Um, I think everybody on this call today is one of our guests that we invite to our annual EDR event down Hilton Head, which regrettably for the second year in a row, we've had to move to um, a non-in-person event. We miss y'all terribly. We are back in our offices. Some of our folks are working from home. Some of our folks are in the office. If you're in the area, we'd love to see you. Please let us know you're coming. Please wear a mask. Please sanitize. But we are back in our building. Um, this time last year, when we were getting together with Pete, um, the world had changed so dramatically and we were all so rocked. I think even for our team, we went immediately into care for our members, care for our industrial members, making sure that they were getting good information, aware of opportunities. But we were all wondering where projects would go and what kind of year we were going to have. And as it turns out, we had just a bang up year. I don't know that anybody could have predicted how well we would do. So our job numbers were down. We were 58% of our goal with a little more than 3,600 jobs. But from a capital investment standpoint, we exceeded our metrics. We were at 100%, 108% of goal at 776 million. And then electric load for us is also one of our metrics, and we did very well there as well. A lot of existing industry expansions, which are key for all of us, is that those industries keep going. Within our industrial sectors, we had a lot of closures and a lot of layoffs, but by year end, the net job loss for industrial members for us statewide was less than 500 folks. And about 250 of those we knew were coming with a closure in the upstate of a distribution facility that was announced almost a year before the whole COVID thing happened. So what we want to do is get Pete back here. And one, we want to revisit some of the things that he said he felt would happen when all of this began. But also the thing that, kind of we hadn't talked about in a long time is what's happening in trade and the issue around trade wars. So he's going to hit some of that today as well. For those of you who don't know Pete, he's a recognized global leader in trade. He was a partner and practice leader for customs practices and with tax firms like Ryan, KPMG, and Crow. He's also done global custom operations and consultancies for some of the major freight forwarders in the country, C.H. Robinson, Crane Worldwide. Today, he's his own man, he's doing his own thing, and he answers to nobody. Kind of like some of his music heroes. We got yesterday, if you see the posters behind him, he's a huge Sturgill fan. And probably most of you know on this call who Sturgill is, but if you don't, Sturgill Simpson. He's a renegade musician, does his own thing, bucks the system, and we could do an entire session, I think, on just music and music history. We're all talking earlier about how much we miss normal live music events. Maybe in future EDR from Afar event, maybe we'll do another concert. But anyway, we wanted to get Pete back. So ground rules is if you got a question, just shoot me a note either in the chat room or you can send me a private message. If you want to ask a question yourself, we'll recognize you and let you come on and ask the question, or just write your question and I will ask it for you. So that, Mr. Pete Mento, the floor is yours, brother.
Thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. I'm excited to speak with you. I do wish we were in person. I was reflecting this morning on a year ago, how much has changed in a year. A year ago, I was down in New Orleans. I was enjoying Mardi Gras, as I do every year. A year ago, I was attending meetings in Washington, D.C., talking about the likelihood that this virus was going to be as big an economic deal as we thought it would. A year ago, I was talking with a number of freight forwarding firms discussing what the impact could possibly be on logistics if there were no passenger aircraft. A year ago, I was listening to a lot of people say that this was containable. A year ago, I had my own doubts. But a year ago, I also said that it was likely that if we had a downturn economically, it would rebound just as quickly as it happened. And I feel confident that that prediction did come through. And we'll go over some numbers, I think, that really go through that. But the thing that I think we need to put our arms around before we really get deeper into this, there has never been an event in the history of my particular area of academia, economics, where we've had real-time data that we've been able to look at to get our head around, like this pandemic. We've never been able to understand consumers' reaction. We've never been able to understand how people just at home were managing to deal with the pandemic. We've never been able to keep a lot of these businesses going in a serious situation of such extreme import as we have just now. I mean, think about where we are right now. Many of you are either at home or at a remote office, and we're able to a degree, keep our businesses running because of the internet, because of our networked ability to keep working. If that hadn't have been the case, this pandemic would have been much worse. So much of what we do as business people has been radically shifted, and maybe forever, because we've learned to trust in a new system and to take a great leap forward in what we have decided to trust. And a lot of what we'll talk about today, a lot of what we'll reflect on, is going to be a question of if we're going to continue to trust it. How much of the old ways are we going to go back to? And how much of the new ways are we going to rely upon? I'm always reminded by my 14-year-old daughter that I'm an old man. And if that doesn't remind me the lack of hair and the fact that I'm a graying, balding, middle-aged, powerfully built economist generally does as well. I don't know how many more years I have left on this planet to observe from afar how things happen. But over the course of these past almost a year now, 11 months, I have seen more radical change than I probably have in the rest of my life. I'll discuss some of that today. But as unfearful as I was of the past 11 months, I'm much more excited of what will happen next. I don't have fear. I really don't. I'm not scared. So I want you all to understand that. This should not be an hour filled with me terrifying you. I'm not Casper the Friendly Ghost going blah to everyone. That's not what these slides are about. What I'm trying to do is show you that there is a path forward. And at the end of it, I do believe that there are a number of economies that are going to win out greatly. And I think the US is one of them. I think that we're going to find ourselves very quickly attaching back on to that runaway train of economic opportunity that we appeared to have been on before the pandemic hit. There are some things that will have to happen, but statistically, they appear like they're probably going to. So I'm not so terrified that they won't happen. Through the course of my slideshow today, I'm sure there's going to be questions. I always welcome them. For those of you who've never seen me speak before, I love interaction, but I ask that you save those questions for the end so that we can really spend some time on them. I've got about 50 to 60 minutes of content here, and there's plenty of time at the end to answer those questions and to have a back and forth. I leave my phone number and my email at the end for a reason. I really do want you to contact me if you have a question. I'm not going to send you a bill for reaching out to me. That's not who I am. And that's it. Yes, I do love Sturgill Simpson deeply. He is one of my absolute favorites. And the reason is he's an evolutionary musician. The man plays everything and he plays it well and he never stops tinkering. And I think that's a really good way to look at how companies are going to need to be in this new economy. People get Darwin wrong. They always say it's survival of the fittest, and that's incorrect. Darwin's actual hypothesis was that the species that's able to adapt will be the most enduring. So it's adaptability, and I think adaptability is something we should be considering today. So with that, on with the show. The last IMF projections that came out for the globe are very telling. And when we look at these, they really broke them down into what they consider economic regions. So keep that in mind. Let's not get too wrapped up into particular countries. We'll get there in a minute, but let's look at regions. Some of this stuff is really obvious, okay? So in Asia, as an example, where they shut down super quick, it should not come as a surprise that we should see them returning to relative economic normalcy, quote unquote, pretty quickly. China will remain a mystery for most of us with regards to what really happened. It's going to take a long time for us to ever really know exactly what happened in that country with regards to just how many people got sick, how it spread, and exactly what happened there. I don't know if we'll ever really know. But what I can tell you is that they locked down quickly. They contained it as fast as they could in their own country. In many other nations around it, we're already in a sense of prevention. When I was a young man and I would go to China and I would spend time in Asia, it was very normal for me to see people walking around with masks. It was a culture of prevention. And immediately when this virus was spreading in China, there were lockdowns in Taiwan, there were lockdowns in Korea. They were not messing around. They remembered the days of the H1N1, the pig virus. They remember that chicken flu, and they were not going to play around with it. So they shut it down quickly. So you'll see there that they're expecting some tremendous growth in that particular region. The Middle East, they got kicked in the teeth mostly because of a depression in oil, and they see that rising as well. Sub-Saharan Africa, et cetera, et cetera. But let's take a look at United States and the Euro area. A U.S. return to 4.5%, and that sort of growth would be, in my opinion, a little more optimistic than I would expect. That has a lot to do with an idea that there'll be a vaccination protocol that's probably more embraced than I think is likely to happen. I don't think that we're going to see vaccinations roll out as quickly and be embraced as much as the IMF believes that they will. Europe, I think you're going to see a much stronger rebound. A big part of that is probably linked to the fact that Europe is now China's single largest consumer of goods. They took that over from the United States last year. They've been inching toward that for some time, but China and Europe now have pretty much normalized the way things are moving back and forth. And I think that over the course of the pandemic, they really took steps to make that even more of a solidified relationship. So I think you're going to see that kind of growth is probably likely. The one thing that might push it back a little bit is Brexit. We'll talk a bit about that down the road, but I think the teething pains of Brexit will be overcome. So I think that 4.5 is an optimistic number. I'm not sure that we're going to reach it, but we'll see. All right, we'll see. But if you look at that, -8, we really took a kick in the teeth over the course of the last year. It wasn't a very pleasant year for the U.S. economy. And really, I mean, let's face it. When you have an economy like ours that's based on consumption, and that consumption economy has a lot to do with face-to-face social economy, going to malls, going to restaurants, going to movie theaters, a lot of what we did was being in contact with one another. And when we lose the ability to be in close contact with one another, all of those concentric circles around it where we support one another, they break down, and it gets harder and harder to support it. We're not going to know for some time just how bad it got. But I can tell you the estimates in major American cities on the number of restaurants that will never open again are absolutely incredible. You hear as much as 50% of some of these places are closed for good. And that the to-go and deliveries are not doing it. People are just barely hanging on. New Orleans, as an example, people were holding on for Mardi Gras. And when the mayor shut down the city, a lot of places said they're just not going to open again. So we'll see what happens there. But digging deeper into these numbers, this is where the rubber hits the road. If you look at forecasts, a pre-corona forecast versus the June 10th forecast for GDP, they're vastly different. Even China, for that matter, wasn't growing nearly as much. Every single country pretty much took an L here, right? This is how deeply the pandemic affected it. In 2017, I gave a speech for the Transportation Asset Protection Association, where I said that I believe that a pandemic would be possibly the most impactful negative affecting thing that could happen to the global economy. And even my predictions of economic impact ended up being down. They weren't nearly as impactful as they ended up being. And that was without me considering how positive an influence networking would be and our ability to keep economies going with laptops and networking and working from home. Think about that. So when we look at some of these countries and where we expect them to return, look at the United States. I don't know if my cursor's on here or not, but it's the 1, 2, 3, 4, fifth one down. We expected a -5% impact on our GDP. That's likely to have been accurate, honestly, as opposed to, we were roaring at one point. But if we take a deeper look, where I'm most concerned is people aren't looking at the deeper numbers. So why is the United States still a country that people are continuing to pour money into? And I know this is a conversation today where we're talking about economic opportunity. And this is an organization that thrives on looking for ways to lure investment to a particular part of the country. All right, so let's talk about that. China is facing a lot of headwinds, many of them associated with manufacturing, trade agreements, non-tariff barriers to entry associated with trade agreements. But a big issue that China has right now is with debt. For years, an individual Chinese private citizen was able to borrow money both within rational means inside of banks and irrational means outside of banks. They were able to borrow money from other private citizens at what could be considered ridiculous interest rates. And because of the world's desire to buy inexpensive products made at pretty low rates of labor, they were able to sell them, pay back those rates, and build strong businesses. When you have a intersection of both a pandemic, high tariffs on goods coming to America, a relatively slow global economy to begin with, high rates for transportation, and increasing competition from other economies, even in your own region, Vietnam, Cambodia, Indonesia, Malaysia, and a rise of a local competitor for US production in Mexico, it becomes more and more difficult to have high enough margins to keep up with your debt. So what you're seeing in China in particular is a quickly rising debt ceiling, where more and more companies are borrowing money. They're speculating even, and they're having a hard time paying it back. Many of these companies were on the brink of closing even before the pandemic, and now they're having hard times making payroll. There is a possibility that China could be facing a debt crisis, not unlike the crisis that the US and Europe faced at the end of the 2008-2009 series. Why this is important is their ability to continue to operate as a manufacturing base for the world is essential. Whether you like it or not, whether we like it or not, we all depend greatly on China's ability to produce goods for the world. They're essential. Second of all, China is not like the United States or a Western European economy. They're able to control monetary policy in a way that we are not. We can never forget that they are a centrally controlled communist government, which allows them a number of levers that we simply don't have. They also don't operate in a short-term political climate like we do, where they have to worry about re-election every 4 to 8 years. So they can take a very long-term attitude towards this. They may have the levers in place to be able to control this debt issue. They may not. But what may happen here because of these debt issues is it may actually drive a climate of reinvestment in China by the government to really push companies that have money to invest to actually invest in production in China. Now, why does this matter to American companies? I'm not sure it matters as much. It would have to be pretty high tier investment. Most of the companies we're talking about that you would be competing with would be high-end, intellectual property type businesses that probably wouldn't want to be in the US anyway. because of intellectual property concerns. So I'm not sure just how relevant this would be for you in the Carolinas, but I'm keeping my eye on this. I think this is going to end up being a real problem for China, and I think it's going to actually drive more investment in infrastructure and drive more investment, big money investment into manufacturing development in China in order to keep that money there where it can be controlled rather than being offshore where it can't. So I'm going to watch this closely. I think you should be watching it too, particularly over the next 5 to 10 years. Okay. This is a fun one. Everybody knows I love history because I am a total nerd. And anytime that there has been a huge economic downturn globally, the good old US of A has led the drive out of it. And this is uncanny. This is uncanny. So anyone that's ever taken a macro class, anyone that's ever studied economics, and you've found yourself in that macro 101 class, usually with a professor like me who who has the smallest, crappiest office in the econ department, a guy that's got hair growing out of his ears, somebody who smells like stale scotch and depression. They come in, and one of the first slides they love to talk about is how the global economy has always been connected, how economies have always been connected, but we never realized that they were connected until probably somewhere around World War I. And then we didn't start manipulating the global economy until sometime after World War II. We didn't really see companies really just hammering the global economy to make them all work together until after World War II, when the Soviets started doing it and the US started doing it, and then big companies started really manipulating the global economy to their own advantage. I mean, it was a sight to behold. See, this is why I'm so pathetic. I get excited talking about this stuff. But whenever we have a serious problem, a big recession, Great Depression, post-World War II, post-Korean War, double-dip recessions of the 80s, the global financial crisis, it has always been the US economy that has drug us out of these problems. Great Depression. What happens? Prior to World War II, FDR, New Deal, you cannot discount the amount of global economic uplift. I mean, just the tailwinds that came from that, the amount of money that was spent by the US. And then World War II. Once World War II happened, and the fact that we were this industrial juggernaut, just like manufacturing all of this stuff in the US for the war effort of the Europeans, then World War II happens. And we get involved. And we are just so good at manufacturing the things that we needed for the war effort. And the whole country was behind it. Every man and woman in this country was either fighting the war or producing for the war. Then after World War II, we blew everybody else's production facilities into the Stone Age. So if you wanted something made, we made it for you. If you wanted something moved around the world, we were the only country left with a merchant marine. And then if you wanted to reestablish your country as a manufacturing operation, it was our unions that built your machinery to send to Japan and Western Europe to rebuild your manufacturing. I mean, it was amazing. That's, post-Korean War, when you start talking about the modern age of the American manufacturing complex, piles of innovation, piles and piles of innovation. We had all of these young American engineers that were coming out of college, young men and some young women as well, that were coming out of college who had war experience, all of these very, very experienced, seasoned, serious young men and women who went into the workforce and developed incredible things. And those incredible things that were cutting edge in technology drive a new American economy up into the 1970s, where we begin to have a slowdown because of energy policy. And then, of course, in the 1980s, a lot of companies were overextended in a globalization and a number of different financial aspects that have a relatively small collapse on our stock market. And it wasn't as effective as we seem to remember it. It was bad, but it wasn't as bad as it could be. The next big thing that happens, of course, is there's some silliness that goes on with lending. Some people begin to believe too much in math, and things go down again. But what happens? There's another increase, and the economy begins to come back because of our new innovation economy. because of all of this investment that started in the 80s in microchips and in communication and in the internet and fuels, space exploration, medicine, all of these amazing technologies that are now turning into products. And then bam, COVID hits. So it's those technologies and investments in them that are going to bring us back out of it again. And the reason I truly believe in this is because of our total current disdain for the theft of intellectual property by the Chinese. I thoroughly believe that America is going to begin to produce more and more sensitive technologies in either the US or NAFTA countries or in nations that we do not feel as concerned about the theft of our IP. Our new economy is based on the production and the creation of ideas, and we are not going to allow it to be exported to countries that are going to simply steal it. If you take the creation of a COVID vaccine, it was done through a collaborative effort amongst a number of different scientists across all these different nations and a bunch of different companies who did not involve the Chinese. Plain and simple. We did not include them in it. We built this vaccine from the ground up. It took us months to do it based on science that had been worked on for decades. And it is a marvel that it was done. If they don't pass out Nobel Prizes like, fun-sized Snickers bars at Halloween in my old neighborhood as a kid, I will be disgusted at the process. The fact that they did it as quickly as they did is a marvel of modern science. But it was done collaboratively amongst countries who trusted one another through science that had been developed through decades. And that's exactly how this is going to happen in sharing that information across these countries on incredibly secure methodologies of networking and technology is how it's going to go from now on. You're going to see production facilities in this country, in Mexico, in Canada, in Western Europe, that are built based on these new technologies. And that is where opportunity is going to reside. And that's where financial benefits are going to yield for decades to come, centuries to come, if we can control the theft and redistribution of our ideas. Speaking of which, it's hard to tell just how much of our economy right now, because we are seeing right now the recovery happening. It's hard to tell how much of it was because of artificial stimulus. So there is still a tremendous amount of Americans who are out of work. There are still a tremendous amount of Americans who are underemployed. There are a lot of people who are economically in danger. They've spent all of the money they had saved up. The number of Americans who have drained their 401ks and their retirements is unspeakable. But there's been a lot of positive as well that I can move to. India has decided that they're in league with the United States now. It's pretty much official. So case in point, they want to move 1,000 manufacturing, companies out of China and into India. So what they're saying is there's 1,000 companies in China that have the benefit of only existing because they make stuff for US consumption. They want to target those companies and have their business move to India. And their Ministry of Trade has identified them. They've identified, I think, 3,500, and they want 1,000 of them to move to India. And I think they've already got 200 and something. They're winning. So they are working, consciously working to move them to India. And I guess China's trying to do the same thing to India, and American companies like, no, we're not doing it. So there's almost like a concerted effort amongst countries that are in league with the US to try to work together on this. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Japan has decided that since the pandemic and what they saw as a non-resilient supply chain, that they're going to make it in the best interest of their companies. And Japan is an incredibly large, very important global economy, to be more dependent on other nations around Asia and less dependent on China. So Vietnam, Cambodia, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand especially, and Australia try to find ways to use those nations as a kickoff point for their supply chain where possible and not be so dependent on China. And then, of course, we have Brexit. One of my favorite stories from Brexit so far is the day that it started. These truck drivers in England, being a truck driver in England it's a fascinating job, but one of the more interesting positions that you can find yourself in is you could be one of these guys that goes across on the ferry every day. So these men and women get up in the morning, they make themselves a big lunch, They get in their truck and they're going to be gone all day. So this is a 12 to 18-hour day for many of them. So they pick up their load, they get on a ferry, and they go across the channel, and they go to France, they go to Germany, they go to the Netherlands, and then they discharge their load. They pick up something else, they bring it back to the UK, they discharge it, and they go home. It is a brutal job. Well, the day before Brexit, everything's cool. It's like it always was. The next day, the paperwork is all changed. It's miserable. There's lines going all over the place because of paperwork. But my favorite part of the story, they pull up and the Dutch customs authorities are all there. And if you've ever been to the Netherlands, you can imagine this scene, right? So you've got British truck driver who has his, his tea, his builder's tea, his good strong tea and his tea thermos. And the big Dutch people are historically the tallest people in the world. Okay, so the big Dutch customs inspector says, hello, can I ask you a question? Did you bring your lunch with you? And the British truck driver says, well, yeah. I mean, I'm in my truck all day. Of course I brought my lunch with me. And he says, well, do you have any sandwiches? Well, yeah, I mean, I'm English. That's what I do. I eat sandwiches. And that is, right? Do any of your sandwiches have meat, cheese, dairy, or mayonnaise in them, or eggs? That is the quintessential ingredient for all English or American, right? Mayonnaise, eggs, prawn. And if you've never had a shrimp salad English sandwich, they're magnificent. And these English truck drivers say, well, yeah. And the guy says, give me all your sandwiches. And the truck driver says, why? And he goes, well, it's against the law to import any meat products, milk products, dairy products, cheese products, or egg products into the European Union. And the English truck drivers say, what are you talking about? The United Kingdom is no longer part of the European Union. And those food products are now subject to confiscation. Hand them all over. And there are pictures that were on Twitter of just dumpsters full of lunches. I mean, full of thousands of sandwiches that they took from these truck drivers. And they said, either you give me your sandwiches or you get back on the next ferry and you go back home, but you can't bring them into this country. So imagine what they were so mad. And then of course, someone set up the sandwich truck right on the other side of the road. But I digress. The point was, what was fine the day before wasn't the next day. And it's not just that, it was certain types of paperwork, the way paperwork was done, certain types of permits, new permits, things that had never been seen before. And these are all teething pains. And I believe that Brexit will sort itself out. But there were new taxes and ways of handling value-added taxes that nobody was expecting. There's a lot of stuff that was ordered by mail, a lot of things that were ordered across the internet that were simply, they were too expensive to have to manage from that point forward. Brexit was a punch in the mouth too. But I think unlike a lot of the things that we're dealing with globally, this will sort itself out quickly. Just keep in mind that it is a temporary fix. Over the course of the next 2 years, the European Union and Great Britain have to figure this out. And they are. England is talking about building an underground tunnel between England and Northern Ireland so that they don't have to transit. They don't have to transit Ireland, which right now is the main port to get to Belfast, so that they can not have to deal with European Union documentation. There are all sorts of smart things that are happening with documents to make it easier. I think what's more interesting, though, is that there is now a blueprint for leaving the European Union. And if a country wanted to, like the Dutch, who talk about it all the time, or if the European Union wanted to kick a country out, which they talk about doing all the time, it could happen. Right. So there are a number of very big threats to global commerce as well that are being talked about. And these threats to global commerce will probably drive decisions on where to invest. That's why I'm talking about them today, because I think it's important that you consider them when you're talking to people. One of the biggest ones is cyber. The SolarWinds cyber hack will end up going down in history as one of the most important incursions to global business that we saw in the beginning of the first 20 years of this century. Thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of businesses, they're saying maybe even hundreds of thousands of different businesses were affected by this, where a cyber hack was successful in getting into so many computers. And it was done with relative ease. It made it all the way to the government. It was in the Department of Homeland Security. It was in the Treasury. It was everywhere. And they laid in wait gathering information. Who knows what they did with it? In the end, who knows what they did with it? The ability to crack into networks. I mean, we're doing this now because we're able to maintain a network. And transportation and logistics is able to maintain its ability to grow and to remain, I want to say, relevant as a technology concern, because we're always introducing new software. We're always bringing in something to allow us to be more connected, whether it's logistics, businesses, or for that matter, if it's the government. We're constantly bringing in more and more technology, and that's what makes it so useful. Cyber threats are only going to get better. And if I were a state actor, if I was a bad guy, I would be knocking down businesses. I would be knocking down nation states using cyber. I got major currency concerns right now. I think that the US dollar is, although it's always going to be a critical currency in my lifetime, I think that the move by SpaceX, as an example, and Tesla to buy $1.5 billion worth of Bitcoin did not help. I think that the fact that you're seeing the Chinese start to hedge a lot more in the euro, yen being bought up, and the fact that we're going to have inflation. You can't continue to play with monetary policy in the US and not expect to see a lot of inflation. It's going to be an issue. Russia is creating a trade bloc amongst former Soviet countries. That's why they invaded the Ukraine. So you're going to see Russia do that. And what scares me about this is that much of the heating natural gas that's used in Western Europe comes from Russia through pipelines that can easily be turned off. You want to scare yourself? Google that. Google it. So Google how much of the European Union is dependent on natural gas that comes from Russia. Now, Norway, the United Kingdom, Germany, a number of other countries, they do their best to supply it, but a ridiculous amount of energy comes from Russia, and they could very easily turn it off. So I think you're going to see another focused attitude about dealing with the strategy associated with that. Mr. Trump tried to convince the Germans to build a natural gas port. I think that since he's no longer in office, I think that project's probably going to fall on its face. It's going to have a big problem right now with logistics concerning air freight. It's going to remain that way for a while. There was rumors last week that we were going to expect to see COVID testing for domestic flights, even possibly a ban on domestic travel under the new Biden administration. That appears to have, I'm not going to say gone away, but they're not talking about it anymore. It's quieted down. I hope it stays quieted down, frankly. But we're not going to see international air freight rates go down, and we're not going to see availability of space until we see passenger flights. Most air freight moves on passenger flights, and we don't have passenger flights going internationally right now, not with any great regularity. Until that changes, freight rates are going to be high for air freight, and space is going to be hard to come by. And with Amazon taking up so much space to keep everybody happy at home, it's going to be hard to find. This one blows my mind. Another great opportunity for companies. All right. There are going to be two supply chains for a lot of technologically advanced companies. Apple has already announced they're doing it. Okay. So whenever Apple makes a new phone now, they're going to make one version via a supply chain in China just for Chinese consumers. They're going to make another version via another supply chain in another country for the rest of the world. So there'll be technology in the rest of the world phone that they'll make in another part of the world, and then technology in the China phone just for China, because they don't trust the Chinese to have access. Wow. So I think this is going to be how things are going to go until we get intellectual property theft under control. And I don't know when that's going to be or how. So I think you're going to see a lot of high-end technology companies opening up production facilities in Western Europe and the US and in Mexico, frankly, because they're going to want certain areas of production done, and especially research in the US rather than in China or low-cost production in Vietnam and Cambodia, because most of those production facilities are owned by Chinese companies. More and more of China taking place in international discourse, taking their seat at the table, not being pushed around. You're going to see China leading conversations about trade where the US simply hadn't been before. I think the Biden administration, particularly with Catherine Tai, who is our new United States Trade Representative, she is not a lady to be messed with. She is one tough attorney. Taiwanese heritage, speaks Mandarin, really knows what she's doing. She was the chief legal negotiator for the USMCA, the new NAFTA. Really smart lady. She's going to do, I think, a great job as a new USTR. But she's going to be up against a China who saw what happened in the last administration, saw what happens when the US puts their foot down, and is going to try to take some high ground really quick while we're trying to get ourselves put together. So they're going to take this opportunity to try to sit down with as many meetings as possible and get as much done while we try to get our agenda put in place. This last one, you're going to see more and more companies moving away from international distribution where products come from overseas, are in a warehouse in the US, and then get distributed to the end consumer. Instead, what they're going to take advantage of is a concept called de minimis. If you as a consumer, so if Pete Mento decides to buy something from a shoe producer, and that shoe producer is sending me a pair of shoes that are worth $800 or less a day, there's a limit called de minimis. As a consumer, I can buy up to $800 a day of goods and not pay any taxes on them from overseas. So they can be sent directly to me from overseas in China, sent to my door, as long as the value a day of imports that I get does not go over $800. It's not dutiable. Not these punitive duties from Trump, not the 321s, not 232s, excuse me, not any of these tariffs, no taxes, nothing. It is untaxable. You're going to see more and more of that. And companies like Amazon and Alibaba, eBay, everyone are going to start using it more and more and more and more and more. So these large distribution hubs are going to become less likely in time, and things are going to be distributed from overseas directly to the US more often. That could be a strategic problem, but we'll talk about that some other time. I'm sorry. All right. So let's talk about theft. The theft of American intellectual property was the reason we got into the trade war with China. That was the main reason. It wasn't to bring jobs back to the US. As wonderful a reason as that would have been, I would have applauded it. That was not the main reason. The main reason was because the Chinese have had a systematic, multi-decade, incredibly intelligent, got to give them credit, plan to steal as much American technology as possible as part of an ongoing plan to be independent and to not need any other country in the world in order to develop what they see as key, very, very important industries moving forward. The FBI director, as well as the CIA, have both said that what they've done has been stunning, and that the US many times has been caught sleeping at the wheel. There have been a number of intelligence operatives that have been caught in major US universities, involved with professors. I'm a Harvard man. See, I can't go more than an hour without saying that. Harvard University was infiltrated. Professors were implicated, as was MIT, UCLA, Berkeley, many of the largest, most important engineering schools in the country. And the past administration went into a trade war trying to, first and foremost, stop that. What can we do to stop the theft of innovation? What you're going to have now is a continuation of that. So you're going to have a continuation of that because there are too many American companies who loved the fact that we got tough about theft. At the same time, you're going to have a bit of a change because of political pressures on the Biden-Harris administration that they cannot be ignored. There were promises that were made and an expectation for probably 10 years now that something was done, and they're in a position to do it. All right, so we're engaged in a lot of trade wars right now with Europe, the United States. We're kind of in one with India, I don't know, sort of. But what's really crazy is a lot of trade agreements that we had worked on really hard for a long time, we walked away from. Most notably, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was a multi-governmental relationship, the US, Japan, Vietnam, Cambodia, all over the Pacific. We walked away from it under Trump. And it's likely that we're going to take a look at that again and maybe even go back into it and no longer look at these bilateral one country to one country agreements, but look at multilateral agreements. Because when the pandemic hit and when the Trump tariffs hit, what a lot of companies realized quick is they had no plan B. They had bought from one supplier overseas forever, and it was awesome. They just, they bought from one supplier overseas and it was fantastic. And then they had to rush to find a US supplier who's probably more expensive but reliable with a short supply chain. And then they needed some foreign suppliers too, but there was nobody in these other countries who had the throughput to make what they needed. So they kind of had a combination of a couple of different companies. And honestly, that's a good place to be, is to have a combination of some American suppliers, some foreign suppliers, and maybe, over time through automation, those American suppliers could even become less expensive. Who knows? But there was a return to sort of thinking differently about supply chains, that there could be a way to do this better. Okay, so aside from all of that, there's also going to be a radical change to how we enforce trade. You've got a new head of DHS who is really going to be heavily focused on immigration in a different way. The last head of DHS was focused on immigration and on ways of keeping people out of the country. The new head of DHS is going to be instrumental in what's going to be a massive change to immigration policy. For those of you who haven't read the news this morning, President Biden has released his plan on immigration to find a way to have an 8-year plan to allow people who are here in this country living and working but are not legal, to find a way to bring them, it's citizenship in 8 years. And that will be a lot of pressure on the head of DHS, which has immigration, border protection, and customs all in it. But when so much is focused on those, customs is probably not going to have as much financial focus, right? So will customs have the money and the leadership and the oversight it needs to really be focused on trade? I'm not sure that it will. And all this new leadership is going to mean probably new attitudes towards what they're going to focus on. I'm not sure it's really going to be as deep. The new trade policy by Biden is also focused on things we've never focused on before. They're saying that they're going to have trade policy that's really focused on environmental policy. So rather than, Biden has to remain looking tough on China. He has to. He can't just make the 321 tariffs go away. I'll give you more about that in a minute. But there'll be environmental policy associated with trade policy, and energy policy associated with trade policy, and LGBTQ associated with trade policy. He just put aluminum and steel tariffs back on Saudi Arabia because of that. So more on that in a moment. There's going to be bills for strategic national stockpiles on PPE, because we never want to be in the situation ever again where there are not enough masks, not enough gowns, not enough whatever. We need gloves for this country again. And it is likely, very likely, that most of that will be produced in the US. I have a very hard time believing that there will be a congressional bill passed that says that PPE in the US strategic stockpiles can originate from anywhere but the US. And right now, this country does not have the manufacturing throughput to do that. So once bitten, twice shy. You're going to see those manufacturing facilities built somewhere. That could be an opportunity. I think that there are opportunities for lockdowns in the future. Again, I was on a call last Wednesday where people were saying that, yes, we're at this amazing tipping point where it appears that cases are going down, but deaths, unfortunately, really have been a bit stable. They're kind of at the same number right now. They're not going down. But that there is a push right now in DC for another lockdown. That's a new buzz I haven't heard in my place before. A new push for a lockdown. And whether or not we have that lockdown, I guess, depends on if the cases continue to go down. So they're saying another 2 weeks. Where have we heard that before? Air travel and air cargo bailouts. Does anyone here honestly believe that this summer Americans will be flocking onto planes again to fly all over the country? I don't. And how many of us will be flying all over the place to go to trade shows and all the rest of it? I don't. So it's likely we'll have another bailout of air travel and air cargo. Automation, I really believe that you are going to see a push in Congress to begin to fund investigation, research into more automation, into more intelligent automation. I think that America, right now, America is one of the world's leaders in building automation and robotics. And I firmly believe that you're going to see America truly put more and more money into it. Because in this pandemic, one of the things that's kept us viable is automation. You're also going to see a congressional report coming out soon that is going to dig deep into cybersecurity in ports, airports, and in our national transportation infrastructure, but that's going to expand. A lot of money is going to be put into maintaining cybersecurity in this country. If it hadn't been for the fact that our national network remained viable, the economy would have fallen on its face. And then the vaccine. This bad weather is not helping keeping people vaccinated. We're spending way too much time making sure some 70-year-old doesn't get vaccinated, or vaccinated twice or whatever the case may be. But the vaccine rollout needs to happen, and it needs to happen quickly. President Biden made the comment a few days ago, I think, that he expects things will get back to close to normal by Christmas. I really wish he hadn't have given a date, but the country being vaccinated, getting people vaccinated, rolling it out, the state by state, all of that, it's so questionable right now. I don't think anyone, certainly not me, has enough information about the number of possible people vaccinated, the amount of vaccines, enough information for anyone to make a claim on when we will have enough vaccines, when we'll have any kind of immunity built up, when things will be back to normal. I tell everyone that I'm not expecting to go to Mardi Gras next year. I don't expect that we'll be back to normal by then. So there's some good news for you. Resiliency is a new popular term, and it's going to stay that way for a long time. People are going to be looking for a mixture, a market basket, if you will, sort of a salad of supply chain options. They're going to have 2 or 3 different vendors that are able to make them essential products, both overseas and domestically. Mexico is going to continue to be just an incredibly important producer of goods, and you're going to see more and more NAFTA countries gaining opportunities. Biden's talking about doing a 10% tax on companies' profits that choose to go overseas to produce goods rather than making them in the US. I don't know how he would enforce that, but it's gaining a lot of political steam. He's also talking about a 10% tax credit for profits on companies who choose to make products here in the US. That's going to be a tough one, not just to enforce, but also to pass through Congress, but we'll see. We'll see. Software for procurement is going to focus on gaps in resilience. So where you've got those gaps, you're going to see more and more pieces of software coming out showing where you might want to have an investment someplace to, you're too invested in China, you're too invested in Europe, you might want to have another place for procurement. Audits now for financial audits for Wall Street are probably going to have something in there about supply chain resiliency because so many companies got bit on this last one. Brexit was not a good dry run for resiliency. I mean, think about it. We just had a pandemic. We just went through these Chinese tariffs, and the next big crisis to hit, all these British and European companies found themselves with broken supply chains again. Like, how many times do you have to be told you need a plan B before you get a plan B? We just had our 3rd one in a year, and people still weren't ready. And I think lastly, US supply chains are still years away from recovery. We're still, dealing with an ocean transportation market that's doing everything they can to take advantage of a situation. We're still dealing with supply chains that are having a hard time catching up. We're still dealing with a number of companies that have gone out of business because they simply didn't have enough orders to keep themselves viable. We're still dealing with a lot of companies that are closed forever. So I'm not sure that we're in a position necessarily to say that things are going to get normal again. It's going to take a while, but the economy is coming back. People are consuming. They never stopped. And for the most part, American companies came out of this thing pretty well. And we're seeing them roaring back. They're investing in technology. They're investing in innovation. And these new ideas and new technologies they put a lot of time and energy and effort into are paying off, particularly in global markets. If we can maintain our dominance from that innovation standpoint and keep our ideas away from folks who mean to steal them, and if this particular administration can find ways to keep them safe, I think we'll be fine. There is no thirst or hunger right now in the White House or at Capitol Hill to stop fighting with the Chinese from a tariff perspective. They are more focused on COVID and maintaining a strong economy. And honestly, folks, the last thing on their mind is stopping these tariffs with China and re-engaging in the trade negotiations. They'll get to them when they get to them. So I'm not expecting the 301 tariffs to go away anytime soon. I think, if anything, it helps Mr. Biden to look tough on China, which he needs to do politically. And I think that you're going to see probably carbon tariffs or carbon taxes on countries that are not living up to their goals ecologically, environmentally. And that's certainly China. And I think you're probably also going to see ones that focus on energy, ones that are not embracing clean energy. And that gives Mr. Biden a chance to impose tariffs on China and allow him to still remain, or quotas even, and remain to look tough on China, while maybe making those 301 tariffs go away and maybe build on a trade agreement. But you're going to have a contentious relationship with China that results in some form of tax or barrier to trade with China on a per diem ad valorem tariff for some time in both directions. The genie's out of the box. Pandora opened the box. We've weaponized those taxes. You can expect them for some time. And also these political taxes, as I said, we went after Saudi Arabia. We have reinstated taxes on the importation of certain raw materials. And that has to do with human rights issues. It's going to stay that way. So you can expect to see more and more of that. They're putting our money where their mouth is as a nation. And you're going to see that as a policy statement for some time. Okay, so for those of you who enjoy the nerdy stylings that I put up here every other Friday, I have a live trade school that's sponsored by TAPA. You're welcome to join us. It's free, where we go over the issues of the day and talk about both trade policy and trade issues. It's 11 o'clock Eastern. If you register, you can listen to the recording. I have a live television show that is up every Monday, brought to you by Cap Logistics, called Global Trade This Week with my partner, Doug Draper. I always say Don. It's live. We talk about the future. We don't talk about the past. So where we see something happening that we think is important, we let you know before it does. And then every week, usually on Tuesday, I drop my podcast, Trade Geek Podcast, where I interview people in the world of global trade, and we talk about what's happening. So that is my content. I can't wait to answer your questions, and thank you for having me.
All right, Pete, we got one question. I'm going to, since she's not shy, I'm going to let her ask her question. Didi, you unmute your phone?
Hi, can you hear me?
We can.
Hello. Great to see everybody. Thanks for putting this on, James. Good to hear from you, Pete. I have a couple of questions since I'm not shy. One of them is, you were talking about India recruiting U.S. companies out of China. Is that in any particular industry sectors or any particular type of company?
Yes. Heavy and automotive parts, chemicals, heavy engineering, agriculture equipment, anything that has to do with aerospace parts. Mm-hmm. So they're going for chemicals and anything that has to do with machine parts. Mm-hmm. Those are the big ones they're going after.
Yeah, one of my big concerns is the electronics and the chip shortages that we're having, which are made primarily in Korea and Taiwan, and then shipped to China to go into goods like cars or washing machines or iPhones or whatever. Is that the electronic sector? Is that one that they're going after as well? And what do you see happening with chip manufacturing globally?
Chips aren't a very pretty thing to make, and they're not clean. They're environmentally problematic. China is one of the last countries that's willing to do that dirty work. And unfortunately, it allows them to hold us captive. So I worry about that one. I think that there are way too many companies right now that are focused on usurping China's ability to be on top of that mountain. And the innovation that they're using is going to stop them sooner than later. You got way too many good companies that are way too smart that are outthinking China right now. So it's only a matter of time before we overcome that technology and come up with a better solution. But for now, it is what it is.
Mhm. Thanks.
Anytime.
Katie. Say, Pete, so what guidance would you have? We got a lot of local economic developers, regional folks. I guess what would you, in a world where we're so used to going out and chasing after the business and we're kind of confined right now, and there are opportunities that are looking at South Carolina, what advice would you give to them on how to prepare for the road ahead? And what is it that, if you were in our role, what would you be doing to make sure that your economy continues to thrive?
Well, I think there's going to be a big push on environmental issues. And, politics aside, you're not going to have much of a choice. When most of the Western world has decided that climate change issues are going to be in every single policy document, monetary policy, financial policy, ecological policy, trade policy, energy policy, whatever you're able to do in order to make it very clear to people that you're able to address that. I think that's important. Labor, having the ability to bring labor to whatever you're building quickly, highly skilled labor, very important. Infrastructure from a technology standpoint. A lot of folks have found out very quickly that it's hard to have stable technology in a lot of these foreign countries. Vietnam has been difficult to maintain internet, to maintain energy and energy resources. Being able to highlight the ability of your geography to maintain a stable power supply. Texas right now is really taking it on the chin from a PR standpoint. Everyone's moving their businesses from California to Texas. When you're in the technology field and you can't keep the power on, well, that's going to be a bit of a problem.
Yeah.
So that's another area I think I would probably focus on. And then logistics infrastructure. When all of these businesses globally were moving from place to place, they hadn't put enough thought into how they're going to move the product once they make it. So that's been an interesting problem and a hurdle to overcome, is it wasn't so tough making it. It's been really hard flying it and shipping it out of these places once they did.
Yesterday, you and I started to talk a little bit about the e-commerce and the continued shift away from traditional box retail, or how all that world is changing. Do you want to share your thoughts on that real quick?
Yeah. Americans have really, we had this huge experiment that we just did that people have been begging for, to find out if we as consumers would embrace going to this, order online, have it delivered at home, BOPIS, buy online, pick up on store. We've been waiting, and it was almost like COVID happened in order for us to push understanding whether or not we would really buy into this. And we did. We bought into it whole hog. We couldn't buy into it harder if we tried. And so since that's happened, we have an industry now who's catching up with our desire to never walk into a store ever again. And as younger generations are perfectly comfortable and happy buying in an environment where they don't buy normal retail, what happens to retail? What happens to the economics that emanate from that retail when you have hundreds of people who work in a mall, hundreds of people who support that mall, and the hundreds, if not thousands, of people who are dependent on those retail establishments? And then, the economy that revolves around retail. Think about the cities that you live in and how many people make their lives either directly working within those establishments or supporting them. They're going to have to find something else to do. When you walk away from those cities into rural environments, it's a different story. But how are we going to make up for those jobs? I'm not sure it's going to happen quickly. And we kind of had this event where we ripped the Band-Aid off. The move towards a more electronic economy when it came to consumer retail happened faster than I think we expected. And now that retail employee is, I'm not sure they're going to be able to transition into a different job fast enough to make up for the difference.
All right, brother, we got another question. Brian, if you'll unmute your phone. Brian.
There we go. Hey,
There you
James. Hey, Pete, this is Brian Gwynn with Norfolk Southern. I had a question about global freight rates. They're pretty much at like global highs right now with container rates. And there's obviously a huge imbalance in the transportation assets around the world right now. And it doesn't seem to be getting any better with the backlog of ships going into LA Long Beach and how many are out there in the Bay. How long is this going to go, and when do you see that getting better?
Oh, what a great question. So as most of you know, the ocean freight companies are able to operate under what would be considered, antitrust rules anywhere else. But these ocean carriers are price fixing. And what the pandemic allowed them to do was a great reset. They all got together and they said, let's just put just enough ships in just enough space where we're able to operate at a profit and make up for all the losses that we've been having for years and years and years and years and years. And although they never really worked in concert very well, they are right now. And it's sort of like when you fill a glass full of water and you put just enough water in it so that there's that lip where it looks like it's about to overflow and it doesn't. There's just enough ships right now where someone's containers aren't moving. And that's how they want it. And they're able to maintain these rates because no one's defected. Of all of these different ocean carriers, there isn't a single person, not a single carrier who said, you know what, I'm going to get it while the getting's good and throw some extra ships out there and make a little more money. They're all holding the line. And as long as these shippers, these carriers decide to hold the line, these rates aren't going anywhere. And as they decide to add more ships in and more space in, they're going to keep rates exactly where they are. I don't think these rates are going anywhere.
Thank you.
Yep. Thanks, Brian. All right, got another question. Says you haven't talked about demographics. Much of the developed world and China are aging into mass retirement, which will impact consumption globally and therefore export-led economies like Germany. What do you see for the European Union and specifically for South Carolina, which we're very, very dependent on automotive exports? How will that impact our economy?
Okay. China is not going to stop growing. It's not growing as quickly as we thought it would, right? But you're not going to have China suddenly start going backward. It will continue to be one of the fastest growing countries by population. India will likely be the world's largest population. It will be the first to reach 2 billion, but China will not be far behind it. Yes, you'll have mass retirements or deaths one way or the other, of course, but as far as population by GDP, it'll be the biggest, but GDP by household, the US will be by far the largest for some time. In your children's life, probably your grandchildren's livelihood, you're not going to see another country with a larger GDP than the United States for probably 4 generations, maybe even longer than that. Boy, I won't be alive to see that, but that was a heck of a prediction. Germany has its own problems. Germany is a country that's aging out. Germany is not making enough Germans. They're not allowing enough immigrants in to create a large enough economy on its own. The problem of automotive has more to do with automotive. It's about technology. It's got less to do with people driving cars and more to do with the cars that we're building and the expense associated with them. It has to do with our dependence on transportation and a change towards our attitudes in the way that they're produced. You've got to look at the question differently. It is entirely plausible that in the next 50 years, it will be illegal in this country and in Western Europe to produce a car that has a combustion engine. So where will the parts for these cars be made? Where will these cars be made? Likely in the United States and in Western Europe. I don't think you have anything to worry about with regards to automotive and parts, because the leading countries where that innovation is coming from is Japan, Western Europe, and the United States. And then China is very far behind in innovation. So as long as that's the case, I think we're perfectly fine. And then Americans are buying cars, and because we love to mortgage our future and spend a ridiculous amount of money on something we really don't need to spend that kind of money on, we'll continue to buy new models, spend what do they say? It's 3 times our average salary on buying a car that we don't necessarily need over and over again. So I don't have any question at all that we'll be perfectly fine in solo automotive. That is one safe industry. It's moving to EVs, but it's one safe industry.
That's good news for us. All right, man. Unless we have any other questions, Pete, thank you again.
Pleasure.
I've had every once in a while, I think you probably see me looking down at this. We've had a lot of text feedback. I'm monitoring the phone, the questions up here. But you're hit once again.
Next time I do this, I better need sunscreen.
What's that?
Next time I do this, I better need sunscreen.
Dude, we all hope you need sunscreen next time we do this. We're going to be putting on, so for our guests, we're going to be putting these on once a month through June. So shortly you should get a save the date for the next program. I'd be remiss if I did not recognize our electric cooperatives who put so many resources into economic development and allowing us to go out and work alongside our communities to create positive change in our state. So we thank them for their investment and for letting us do this program. So with that, everybody have a great, as we head into the weekend, have a great weekend and stay safe. Thanks, Pete.
Thank you.